So thank you very much for that, Mr. Follett, for your time. We are here today to talk about a new novel that is being released in Brazil, Never. And Never is about how could we find ourselves in the brink of nuclear war. I would like to know what led you to write about this topic.
Well, the book is inspired by the events leading up to the First World War, particularly the events of July 1914, when it seems to me that nobody really wanted a war in 1914, but all the leaders of the European countries made decisions which took us step by step closer to war. They didn't intend the war, but when their decisions added up, they added up to war. And I figured all this out when I was writing Fall of Giants, which is set in World War I. And I have always wondered, could the same thing happen again? Could it happen today? Could there be a war which nobody really wanted, but which just happened the way the First World War happened because of a series of decisions? And so I tried to imagine that series of decisions, and that's the book.
Great, great. And you, in the book, you make an allusion to the fact that the West is fearful of losing its power, its preeminence. How much do you feel that this fear may underlay some destabilizing influences you explore in this book?
Well, I think that's true, but it's also true that every national leader is afraid of losing his country's influence. It's a very strong feeling in France today, for example. France doesn't feature very much in my book, never. But there's a strong feeling in France amongst French people that they used to be a very important power, and French used to be the language that everybody had to learn, and they fear that they're losing that preeminence. But I think if you looked into any country, you would find that they felt they had a certain amount of power and influence, and they were frightened of losing it because then they would become vulnerable. So I think the feeling that you've pointed to is a very common one.
Yeah, definitely. But let's just step back a little. You were talking the factors that started the World War I, the killing of a man in Sarajevo. Which are the parallel that we have here in Never, the modern parallel of this particular incident?
In Never, the parallel to the assassination in Sarajevo is the killing of an American soldier in Chad, on the border actually between Chad and Cameroon. Killed by a terrorist using a Chinese rifle. And like the assassination in Sarajevo, in itself, it's not a very important event, but it has some symbolic value. And the other side feel, in the Americans, in the case of Never, and the Austrians, in the case of the Sarajevo killing, felt they had to respond. They had to retaliate. Even though it was a relatively trivial event, their pride, their national pride, meant that they had to retaliate. And that reaction is exactly the kind of thing that makes small events escalate into major events.
Yes, yes. In the book also, you drove a link between climate change, migration, and conflict over oil. and how these factors can destabilize security at the point of a threatening nuclear war between US and China. So would you explain a little bit more on this, please?
Yes. In Never, two characters make a journey across the Sahara Desert. They begin in Chad, near to Lake Chad, and they cross the Sahara Desert and they end up in Europe, in the south of France. That journey symbolizes a problem for me, the problem of climate change, because it's a long time since I wrote this book and I'm forgetting the characters' names. Kia, the Arabic woman, Kia, has to leave her home in Chad because the lake is drying up. And this is part of a process we call desertification. And she goes, she doesn't want to leave. She has lived there all her life. It's her home, but she has to leave because she can find no way to live and to feed her child if she stays. So she takes this journey, and Abdul goes with her. And she crosses the Sahara Desert and she goes to France. So Kia links Lake Chad, the shrinking lake, with Europe. And of course, the reason Lake Chad is shrinking is because of climate change. And the reason we have climate change is that we in Europe fill our cars with so much gasoline and we use so much electricity, which is produced by oil and produces carbon. And so the journey of Kia links what is going on in Africa with what is going on in Europe. And I just felt that journey was kind of an important symbol of the way in which we can't do anything without consequences in the modern world. If we fill up our cars with petrol, then the Sahara Desert will continue to move south. And all of these people in Central Africa will have to go somewhere. This is happening already. Migration from Central Africa is a matter of millions of people a year. And some of them come to Europe or try to come to Europe. It's a problem because many Europeans feel that they can't cope with so many migrants. But the problem is being caused, what we perceive as a problem for us being caused by Africans is happening because we are causing climate change. So there's a kind of circle there that I thought was a good symbol.
Yeah, it's a wonderful way to capture the spirit of our time because it's all together there. They are the main problems that we have here, and it appears very clearly in the book. So it's great. But the conflict is between United States and China. But if you take, for example, the head of the cover of the New York Times online now is saying that Russia has declared a new phase of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
What in your opinion will be the next steps of this conflict?
In Ukraine?
Yeah.
The Ukrainians have established a southern corridor from Crimea in the south to Donetsk in the west. And this battle is going to be like a club sandwich because the Russians hold a lot of ground in the east of the country. The Ukrainian army, a little to the west of them, has been for years trying to keep the Russians in that eastern part of the country. Now, another Russian army is coming up on this side from the south to attack the Ukrainians from the west and try to get them in a sandwich. But you have to remember the Ukrainians occupy this whole country. So there are more Ukrainians over here. You see what I'm saying? Ukraine, Russia, Russia. That's why I say it's like a club sandwich. And that's, nobody knows how that battle's going to end. We've seen that the Russians are right now, the Russians are not good fighters. They have been very inefficient. Morale is low. Of course, all these soldiers have been told lies about Ukraine, and now they're finding out the truth, and that weakens their will to fight. On the other hand, Russia is an enormous country, and although it's not really a rich country, the Russians always have enough money to buy more weapons. And that's, the Ukrainians are much smaller, less rich. So the battle is between, it's like, I guess it's like an elephant and a tiger. Or maybe we should say a bear, because the Russians are bears, aren't they? The Russian animal is the bear. So maybe we've got the Russian bear, which is very big and very strong. And maybe it's the Ukrainian, I don't know, maybe it's the Ukrainian tiger that's attacking the bear. Much smaller, but much more lively, much quicker to move, and much more aggressive. So that's it. It's a club sandwich, and I don't know, and I don't think anybody in the whole world knows how this is going to end.
The beginning of the invasion and the sanctions from the West started. Putin has said something about nuclear weapons again, and you mentioned in previous interviews that you see the threat for nuclear weapons to be much higher today than it was in the 90s, for example. Would you comment on that? Do you still think that we are in danger?
Yes, I certainly do. And I think, I was born in 1949, around about the time that the Soviet Union exploded its first nuclear device. So all my life, I have lived with the danger of nuclear war. But it seems to me that the danger is greater today than it ever has been during my lifetime. And that's because world tensions are much greater. It's also because more countries have weapons, and there are more nuclear weapons in the world now than ever before. There was a period in the 80s and 90s when we actually started to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in Europe. And a lot of us thought, this is the beginning of the end. Maybe we will be safe again. But it wasn't true. It didn't last. And we've been building more nuclear weapons ever since. And the world has become a more tense place ever since. Looking back, the Soviet Union, we sort of understood the Soviet Union. The Europeans and the Soviet, we understood one another, and the Americans understood. The Americans used to make a lot of fuss about communism, but it wasn't really a danger to them. Communism was never a danger to the United States. And but now it seems, the United States, instead of leaders like Eisenhower and Kennedy, we get people like George W. Bush and Donald Trump. So the United States is much weaker than it used to be. It's badly led. When communism ended, we thought Russia wouldn't be aggressive anymore. Boy, we were wrong about that, weren't we? Boy, were we wrong. It's very aggressive now because it's led by one man. It's an autocracy. It's a dictatorship. It's led by one man. And what happens when he's like a king. Putin is a king, really. And what happens with a king is that people who say to him, look, you're wrong about this. You can't do this. It's a bad idea. They get fired. And people who say, yes, boss, we can do that. Yes. And then they, oh yes, we've done that. Don't worry about it. It's done. Great. That's what happens to dictators. They become surrounded by yes men and they lose touch with reality. Putin has lost touch with reality, and that makes him very dangerous. So there's a possibility, I don't think it's a strong possibility, but it's a real possibility that he will use nuclear weapons. And think about that. I mean, this is something that this is different from what I imagined in my book. But imagine now that Putin just drops one nuclear bomb on Kiev, destroy Kiev. It would turn that part of Ukraine into a radioactive desert. Do you think the Americans would have a nuclear war with Russia because of that one nuclear bomb? I don't think they would. They would have conversations. You might remember in my book, the Americans have conversations. The president has conversations with the military about nuclear war and says, okay, imagine this scenario. How many Americans would die in the first strike from Russia or China? And they say 60 million. And she says, Jesus Christ, we can't do that. And I think that's what would happen if Putin used nuclear bombs in Ukraine. I don't think the Americans would use nuclear bombs in retaliation. So anything I can think of, Putin can think of, okay? So he may be thinking, I could drop one bomb and maybe the Americans wouldn't retaliate.
Yeah, it's a game of chess.
Exactly.
Would you tell me a little bit about your research process for this wonderful novel, Never? Because it's full of references, very detailed, the depth that you go when you talk about foreign affairs. And so I'm very curious to know, how do you get to have all this information to write so beautifully a novel like this?
Well, I started out by interviewing people, and I was able to get interviews with a few people who are really, or have been really at the top in international negotiations. So I interviewed Gordon Brown, who is a former Prime Minister of the UK, and Catherine Ashton, who was European First Minister for Foreign Affairs and Security. And I interviewed Kim Darroch, who was the British ambassador to Washington. I also talked to a number of academics who study international strategy, and in particular China, the Chinese government, the Chinese military, and the Chinese Secret Service. And so I began with interviews, and then I read a lot. I always do read a lot of books. And remember, I'm completely immersed. Whatever book I'm writing, I'm able to completely immerse myself in the background to that book. It means I have time to read all these books. I normally also visit places. That wasn't really possible with Never because it was the pandemic. No, there were no planes flying for a while. But I've been several times to China. I've been many times to Washington, D.C. I've been inside the White House several times. And although I've never been to Chad, but I've been to North Africa, and I've been to the Sahara Desert. So I had some knowledge. And I read everything that there is in print about the Chinese Secret Service. I subscribe to magazines, China Quarterly, Strategic Studies magazine, military stuff. And some of my advisors are really deeply into this stuff and write papers about it and books about it constantly. So I had a lot of advice. I just did a lot of work, cracked a lot of books, looked at a lot of photographs. There is, on the internet, there is one photograph of the headquarters of the Chinese Secret Service. It's the only one. You can't see much. It's a campus. It looks kind of like a university with a lot of buildings in a big area. I was able to talk to people who knew about the Foreign Office and how it works, the Chinese Foreign Office and how it works. The Chinese government has a big compound in Beijing called Jiangnan High. And it has 2 lakes, and it used to be a park for the emperor in the old days. And now all these palaces have become government buildings. And that's where all the decisions are made. And you can't get in. They wouldn't let me in now. They wouldn't let journalists in now. They probably don't even let Chinese journalists in. But for a brief period in the Mao era, it was open to the public and people could go in and walk around. And people took photographs, and those photographs are on the internet. So even though it's a secret place now, there are some photographs of it. And that's the kind of thing that I did.
Congratulations, because the result is very, very impressive.
Thank you.
And I wonder if the book was published in China. I don't think so. They didn't want it to.
No, a lot of my books have been published in China, and they're quite popular. They're translated into Mandarin, and there are 2 versions of Mandarin and abbreviated Mandarin, I think it's called. Anyway, both. Normally, my books are published in both of those languages, and they sell quite well. And my Chinese publishers come every year to the London Book Fair. So I meet them and I talk to them about publishing my books. They're very nice. The company is run by 2 very, very smart young women. And we sent them this book when I finished it. We sent them the typescript. And it took them a long time to respond. And then they wrote me a letter saying they were very sorry, but they did not think that this book could be published in China smoothly. Now, this is a funny word, smoothly, for them to use. And I guess what happened was, they showed it to the Communist Party and said, we're offered this book. Can we publish it? And the Communist Party said, no, you certainly can't publish it. I don't think I've been unkind to the Chinese government. I mean, there are some, they do some things wrong. They make some mistakes, but so do the Americans. And in both cases, both governments have to contend with 2 camps. There's the militaristic, aggressive camp. In China, it's the Communist Party. In the States, it's the far right, the Donald Trump types. And there's a battle between those and the more centrist, more rational people. That's the same in both countries. But of course, the Chinese government is very sensitive, and they would not see it this way. They would see that in my fictional novel, the Chinese government does some embarrassing things, and they would not want that to be published. And I expected that. I didn't really think they would publish it. I would have liked them to, but I thought the chances were very small.
Yes, definitely. Well, I have one last question. It's my curiosity. I know that you have an obsession with cathedrals. I recently read an article that you wrote on the Guardian, which you tell that you were a young reporter when you went to visit a cathedral, and then everything changed, and it inspired the Pillars of the Earth, which is your most famous book. So would you comment on this because and you mentioned the cathedrals in Cologne, Florence, Canterbury, and they are beautiful cathedrals. I would like you to comment on this a little bit, please.
Well, when you stand in front of one of those cathedrals, sooner or later, everybody asks two questions. How did they build this? And why did they build it? Because they were very difficult to build in the Middle Ages. You know, the masons had a hammer and a chisel, and that was it. That was the tool, you know. They're very tall, and you think, how did those enormous blocks of stone get lifted? They didn't have an elevator. How did they lift those blocks of stone? And how did they lay it out? And most of all, you think, this place is so beautiful, but it was built by people who lived in wooden houses and slept on the floor. You know, ordinary people didn't have beds in the Middle Ages. Beds were for rich people. Ordinary people slept on the floor with blankets. And so it's a kind of a mystery why these fabulous buildings are still, which are still there, why they were built. And so I became curious about those two things, how they were built and why they were built. And I began to read medieval history books, books about how the cathedrals were built, some quite complicated books. Sometimes the architecture is quite hard to understand. You know, you have to visualize it in 3 dimensions. And if you think about the vaulting, the ceiling of a cathedral, when it curves like this, and the ribs go up to the middle, those, the sections of those ceilings, they curve that way and this way. No medieval person had the mathematics to describe that curve. It wasn't until much later, 20th century, I would think, that mathematics developed that much. It was all done by hand and eye, and yet they're perfect. So you look at that and you marvel. And of course, at the same time as I developed this interest, I was trying to make it as a novelist. I was writing novels in my spare time. Most of them were published. They were not very successful, but I was still thinking about this kind of thing. And eventually, I wrote a good novel and became a full-time novelist. And after a while, I went back to this idea of writing a novel that would explain the cathedrals, why they were built and how they were built. And you probably know, I've said in previous interviews that a lot of people didn't want me to write the book because they said, you know, you've had all this success with thrillers and, you know, the Nazis and the KGB, and now you want to write a book about building a church in the Middle Ages? Are you sure? But of course, I wanted to write a popular book. I didn't want to write, I have never wanted to write the kind of book that people say it was very difficult to read, but it was worth it. People often say that about a book, don't they? A writer like Philip Roth, for example, people will say, well, it was difficult to read, but it's really good. And that's never been my thing. I've always wanted to write something that people love immediately. And I wanted the book about the cathedral to be like that. So I felt confident that I could write a popular book about this subject, but my publishers were very, very worried about it. And of course, in the end, it worked out okay.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Follett, what a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for your time, for being here to talk to our Brazilian readers. There's a lot of people that love you here. So thank you very much again.
A pleasure. I enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.